Welcome to episode 3, everyone. Lost the beard, still haven't got a haircut. So, a key theme in our course, and one that we've been developing more fully in our recent discussions, is that claims to truth are always political, and thus, by way of assumption, science is always political. Such a statement, which is effectively an adage in STS, often elicits strong objections. After all, science and politics, according to a common view, are opposites. Science's virtue lies precisely in its ability, or at least its potential, to transcend politics. The term politics carries all sorts of negative connotations. It's something you don't discuss in polite company, or at least at the dinner table during holidays with your family. Politics is a matter of opinions, of rhetoric and slogans. It's petty and often deceitful. It's about using influence, power, and wealth to get what you want. Science, in one of its most common idealizations, is defined as precisely the opposite of all of these things. So the phrase, "science is always political," appears to undermine these distinctions. It seems to reject certain scientific ideals, and that's exactly how it's been interpreted. Our current post-truth conflicts are marked by these kinds of interpretations. The battles, ostensibly, are about separating truth from politics. Anxieties about the politicization of science, in a pejorative sense, are common. Returning to our theme from the previous session, the worry is that if a view of science as political is promoted, then there will be nothing to guard against the reckless politicization of science. There will be no transgression, no boundary broken if you claim scientific truth with no regard to anything but your own political desires. This is the alleged danger that STS presents in promoting post-truth. But as we've been discussing, this concern is hardly new. The exact same worry that the work of STS will ultimately undermine science fueled a set of academic and public disputes 25 years ago. These disputes were quite lazily dubbed the science wars. Now, these came at the tail end of wider debates about that other post we've been talking about, postmodernism. In 1996, an American physicist named Alan Sokal published a paper in a special issue about the science wars in the cultural studies journal Social Text, entitled "Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity." The paper, which was heavy on terms lifted from post-structuralist literary theory and talked of the social construction of reality, was ostensibly the attempt of a scientist to interpret his work through the lens of a smattering of concepts lifted from so-called postmodern philosophy. Since the purpose of the special issue was to think about ways to resolve the science wars, the editors of Social Text published the paper on these grounds. At the same time, in a different journal, Sokal published another article claiming that the Social Text article was a hoax. In it, he had made dubious or outright false claims about various physical laws or theories. The fact that Social Text would publish a paper containing scientific nonsense without consulting an expert in quantum physics, Sokal claimed, was an indicator of the poor intellectual standards of various fields looking at science from the perspective of the humanities and social sciences. On the face of things, Sokal and others who defended science and the science wars were concerned about a decline, or at least a perceived threat, to the standards of knowledge, and science represented the highest of such standards. And this wasn't just about the inability for humanities scholars or social scientists to spot scientific nonsense. Sokal wanted to imply a link between alleged poor academic standards and what he saw as an unacceptable epistemology. He was ostensibly fending off the threat of epistemic relativism, which was posed by constructivist approaches to science. Sokal was so concerned with relativism that he even dismissed the naturalistic methodological relativism of scholars like Collins, arguing that it is a kind of gateway drug to epistemic relativism. And Sokal's argument against relativism was actually quite similar to the ones that Blackburn offers, which is that adopting relativism as a philosophical position will ultimately lead to contradictions. The archetypal form of this argument is the self-refutation charge, a contradiction in the form of a liar paradox. Relativism states that there are no universal truths. If this is universally true, then relativism refutes itself. If it's only relatively true, then it might mean that there are universal truths. Personally, I think people give this logical exercise far more weight than it deserves. As Blackburn argues, thinking about and defining truth purely in logical terms is extremely limited in thinking about what our inquiries should actually look like. And the standard response to the argument is that what constitutes universal truth is precisely what is in question. It's not something that can be assumed. So the self-refutation charge only works if we have a clear notion of what constitutes universal truth in the first place. The argument that so-called relativists make is not merely that there are no universal truths in some standard accepted sense of the term, but that nothing can be said to be universally true, or at least these can't be known, in the ways that philosophers traditionally have argued they were. For example, through intuition, or pure rational thought, or revelation. Less abstractly, Blackburn points to a more pragmatic contradiction. To employ the products of science in useful ways is effectively to countenance science. You implicitly admit that science works, and thus you are obliged to support the way it works. You must acknowledge that scientific inquiries work. He's suggesting that in order to accept the useful products of science, you must implicitly grant for a certain philosophy of science. If your epistemological position denies that science is a uniquely useful form of knowledge creation, then you have an incoherent philosophy. If you're a relativist, you have no right to avail yourselves of the benefits of science. It's a signifier that people are being irrational, because this is what science is ultimately about, a commitment to rationality. And if you're contradicting yourself, then you must be irrational. Sokal too thinks that relativism leads to an incoherent philosophical position, but he was also quite explicitly concerned with historical and sociological accounts of science. He criticized the work of STS. He thought STS did not produce good accounts of scientific development. While he understood that principles like impartiality or symmetry were only methodologically relativistic in order to get at the social factors involved in science, he simply could not understand why any history of science would focus so much on social factors. To Sokal, the only account that made sense was that scientists were actually discovering the truth about natural phenomena. Just as Blackburn argued that to avail yourself of the benefits of science demanded respect for a certain epistemology, Sokal suggested this also demanded respect for a history of science. It demanded an acknowledgement that science progressed towards ever more accurate accounts of the natural world. In other words, towards truth. What's important to iterate here is that so many of these debates in the science wars 25 years ago and about post-truth now are about larger commitments that finding science to be useful demands. Not being a relativist was one of the commitments demanded by people like Sokal or Blackburn, or defenders of science like Richard Dawkins, active both in the science wars and current debates about post-truth. For Sokal, he extends these commitments to sociological and historical accounts of how science works. What is probably becoming clear is that debates then and now, while often framed in narrow philosophical terms, are about broader images of science. This is something for us to continue to ponder in this course. If we want to employ science to give us benefits, or more deeply, if we believe in science, What does that demand of us? What are we committing ourselves to? Turner is right that the focus on relativism distracted from all the more crucial commitments that were being made. Why was there so much focus on relativism in the first place? The actual danger relativism posed to science, as if scientists were all of a sudden going to become relativists, was non-existent. This is echoed by Lynch in the readings from last session. To see STS, or literary theory, or any other academic discipline that the vast majority of the public hasn't heard of, or will never read, as a threat to scientific truth, seems a bit absurd. So, as Turner claims, there must be something deeper at issue. There was still a further justification to why rationality mattered in the first place. The ultimate commitments being demanded by defenders of science were not to rationality, but to politics. In the two books that Turner reviews, by Brown and Kitcher, this commitment is made explicit. Scientific rationality, these authors hold, is necessary for democratic politics. As Turner notes, Sokal makes the same kinds of commitments, and quite explicitly. In an accompanying article in which Sokal revealed a hoax, he lays out his political ideals, which he describes as old left, committed to traditional liberal principles like social welfare, the elimination of poverty, the maximizing of human potential, and the promotion of general human prosperity and well-being. He presents these political commitments as a justification for his critique of relativism and postmodernism. It's how he legitimizes the hoax. His argument is that epistemic relativism and the broader disregard for science it supposedly symptomizes is a barrier to realizing this politics. He is making a political argument for why science matters. Sokal, along with the Belgian physicist Jean Glickman, ended up publishing a book following his hoax entitled Fashionable Nonsense, elaborating on his critique of postmodernism. But there he tries to walk back his political commitments. Sokal and Glickman try to present their rejection of epistemic relativism as an intellectual concern, stating that it has, quote, little, if any, conceptual or logical connection with politics. The deep irony here is that they have carelessly demonstrated one of the key arguments coming out of STS, that science is political. Their sheepish attempt to return to an apolitical epistemology, in fact, just reinforces this. Various STS scholars have noted that there's almost a paradox here. The more pronounced the claims to apolitical science, a truth that transcends politics, the more politicized these claims are. Those claims to truth are not arbitrary. Scientific truth matters precisely because we want to put it to use, in the fulfillment of democratic ideals, for example. What I think is so unfortunate about the science wars and much of our current post-truth discussions is how much people talk past each other on this point. Sokal, for his part, at least recognized that he shared many of the political concerns of those he criticized. But he still failed to realize that his foray into relativist epistemology and his defense of a sort of scientific realism was an attempt to enact his politics. If people were more reflexive about this, then the terms of debate about post-truth would be less metaphysical and more grounded in the piecemeal ways that technoscientific inquiry is bound to serious, concrete ethical concerns and political challenges.
I should say a few more words here about politicization. The STS adage, all science is political, is so jarring to people because colloquially, both of those terms have a relatively narrow meaning. Politics, as commonly understood, is what politicians do. It pertains to political parties, structures of governance, allegiances and ideologies, voting, election sloganeering, and so on. And as we discussed previously, politics in these regards has become increasingly polarized and partisan. So typically, what people mean when they say science should be free from politics is usually that science should be non-partisan. This is perfectly understandable, and it probably represents a good epistemic and political norm. All politics has to operate with some non-partisan values. Opposing political parties have to agree at the very least on the basic structures of the governments they participate in. There are standards of deliberation within the legislative bodies of countries. Legislators, in other words politicians, have to share those standards. They have to agree that certain kinds of argumentation is admissible. You can't pass a law that's unconstitutional, for example. So, as an ideal, protecting science from partisanship in the realm of politics and policy would mean making scientific standards a part of the Constitution, so to speak. As a political norm, expert knowledge claims would need to be respected according to the standards of those expert disciplines. As an ideal, it seems fine. But as an ideal, expecting politicians don't lie is also fine. This would arguably solve some problems, at least of the most blatant kind. It would preclude bad faith questioning of expert knowledge. It would preclude putting experts on the same level as non-experts on technical matters pertaining to policy. But it needs to be noted that deeper problems would still remain. First, even if expert knowledge claims were less contested in themselves in the political realm, you would still have deep conflicts about what science is relevant. When a matter of fact becomes a matter of concern, in Latour's terminology, this does not necessarily involve any contestation about the matter of fact, which is simply to say that people could agree on the matter of fact, but they could disagree deeply about what social or political implication it has. In the cases of climate change or COVID-19, for example, even if you eliminate disagreement about basic matters of fact, about whether human activities are warming the climate or the precise death rates linked to the coronavirus, you still have massive disagreement about what to do about these matters of fact. There is an implication that at times becomes explicit in discourses surrounding post-truth that harkens back to technocratic ideology, that respect for scientific truth will not only settle matters of fact, but also matters of concern. That giving science a central role in politics would solve political problems. At its extreme, the view is that science would eliminate the need for politics. In the words of the manifesto of the technocracy movements of the early 20th century, social challenges would be addressed as, quote, scientific, technical, and engineering problems. There will be no place for politics or politicians, finance or financiers, racket or racketeers, end quote. And this is precisely the line of thinking that scholars in the STS tradition have sought to problematize. The critical point here is that non-partisan politics is still politics. Constitutional norms are political. The minutiae of partisan politics distracts people from this larger sense of the political, the big projects of creating the kind of world that we want to live in. The everyday institutions and actors of governments are just a particular instrument for achieving this. And so is science. And it's certainly a very open question, one for you to consider, if scientific norms are more conducive to a democratic politics than any other kind. Totalitarian governments of all sorts employ what is for all intents and purposes objective scientific knowledge. To take Blackburn's argument facetiously, imagine arguing that because the autocratic regime in North Korea uses science to conduct nuclear weapons testing, that Kim Jong-un is obliged to respect the truth. Conversely, another very open question for you to consider
it's not at all clear that democracy demands a reverence for scientific truth. In fact, and this is the bigger topic with which Turner grapples, and STS as a whole grapples, what the relationship between a commitment to science and a commitment to democracy should look like is confounding. To phrase the problem bluntly, democracy and expertise are at odds with one another. Democracy as an ideal calls for a diversity of voices, indeed a totality of voices. Democracy fully realized would mean that every citizen's voice has been clearly heard. In order for one to express their views, restriction should be minimal or non-existent. Indeed, a democratic system should facilitate the ability for people to enter their viewpoints into political deliberation. Expertise, on the other hand, is about limiting voices. It is fundamentally about demarcating certain kinds of knowledge claims, those held to expert standards, from others. Viewpoints offered for deliberation need to be qualified according to rather strict standards. We can relate this to Kitcher's notion of tutored preferences, and in the context of post-truth, to Collins, Evans, and Weinell's argument for a normative theory of expertise grounded in the sociology of knowledge. Both Kitcher and Collins, Evans, and Weinell think that constraints must be placed on democracy in order to avoid what the latter call technological populism. This would be technoscientific decision-making by an ignorant mob, or worse, a populace whose political preferences are manipulated by a narrow set of powerful interests. But as Turner argues, this seems to create a fundamental conflict. Either you commit yourself to the democratic ideal that governance, and by extension, the role science plays in society, is determined by the public at large, or you undermine this ideal, and thus democracy, and insist that the public is not fully capable of self-governance. Unless, of course, the public just happens to insist on placing the particular constraints that you advocate upon themselves. And it is for this reason that Collins and Evans' approach to expertise has been called undemocratic. But as Turner points out, democratic ideals are rather vague. There is no essentialist definition of democracy, other than perhaps that every citizen should be able to participate in the political deliberations that will affect their lives. Suffice it to say, there's not even agreement about whether democratic means of deliberation are a virtue in and of themselves, or democratic consequences like equitable socioeconomic outcomes or accountability for the powerful define the morality of a democratic political system. And still more disagreement as to what the precise relationships between democratic means and ends are. Perhaps democracy is fundamentally a paradox. One of the key stimuli for our current post-truth concerns is the phenomenon of democratic backsliding, whereby the very institutions of democratic politics are leveraged in order to undermine democracy. This is one of the reasons we have constitutions in the first place. Turner talks of pure democracy, but perhaps a better term is direct democracy, where every legislative decision is put to referendum. Accusations of being undemocratic are rhetorically heavy, but have less of an impact when you start to understand that all democracies, in practice, already involve constraints. No one lives in a direct democracy. They are all representative democracies, whereby some citizens participate in political deliberations to a much greater extent than others.
And we already have qualifications on full citizenship. You have to reach a certain age. So it's unclear when Turner talks of the liberal democracy in which, quote, public discussion is open and unrestricted by the state and unmolested by the intervention of official tutors, and which Turner argues has seemed to be the best solution for getting working agreements on what to pursue and how to pursue it, whether he imagines that he is describing some actual existing democracy or an ideal. Elsewhere, he talks somewhat ominously about how Kitcher's vision of expert constraints on political deliberations would involve control of information. But Kitcher's and Collins, Evans, and Weinel's arguments for the special role of science and expertise in democracy are premised on the fact that our democratic political systems already suffer from the control of information by powerful interests. And this control is antithetical to both democratic means and ends. So much so that expert knowledge that could directly benefit people is being openly contested. So, at first glance, talk of constraining political deliberation via expertise might seem undemocratic. But virtually all such positions argue that these arrangements would actually promote democratic ends. For example, helping the most marginalized in society. So the fundamental conflict is not between an untutored public who autonomously generate their own concerns on the one hand and a technocratic oligarchy on the other, but between differently informed publics. Our conceptions of democracy did not spontaneously emerge from some pure, unmanipulated public. This points to another tension in thinking about democracy. How do you maintain public support for democracy? The most common response is that education and democracy are inseparable. A democratic politics presupposes a free and open education system. Perhaps this relationship gives us a more generative framework for thinking about these problems. Instead of thinking about expertise as creating a relationship between rulers and ruled, which then seems to create these fundamental democratic conflicts, perhaps we can turn to a teacher-learner relationship. This relationship is not absolute, but relative to the inquiry and the knowledge one can offer. It can be inversed. The learners can become teachers. And everyone at some point is a learner. And learning always involves asking questions, which brings us to our topic for next session: how to make expertise accountable in public deliberations. Here I think the concept of learning is indispensable. To enter into political deliberations requires this double relationship. Not simply what knowledge I can bring to the discussion, but what do I need to know? So I'll end on this question. As STS experts, or soon to be, what can we teach that could improve techno-scientific deliberations? And more importantly, what can we learn?